"Your wife is still alive," the little girl said quietly, and for a moment the wind over the cemetery seemed to stop moving. Thomas Becket had heard thousands of voices in his life, board members, reporters, politicians, investors, but none of them had ever sounded like that, calm and certain in the middle of a moment that was supposed to be final. The billionaire stood beside the polished granite memorial where his wife's name had just been engraved, the rain tapping softly on black umbrellas and dark coats as dozens of guests shifted uncomfortably on the wet grass. The ceremony had been planned with precision, just like every other part of Thomas Becket's life, because control was the only way he knew how to survive loss. 1 year earlier, his wife Elena had disappeared during a violent storm while sailing off the coast, the search lasting 3 exhausting days before the authorities concluded what everyone feared: the ocean had taken her. There had been no body, only broken pieces of the yacht found miles away, drifting like silent evidence across the gray water. The official reports called it a tragic accident, the newspapers called it a mystery, and Thomas Becket had eventually learned to call it the past. Until that voice appeared behind him. He turned slowly, rain sliding down the edge of his coat, and saw a girl standing a few yards away near the iron fence that separated the cemetery from the quiet road. She couldn't have been older than 11. Her jacket was thin for the cold afternoon, her sneakers damp with mud, and her dark eyes stayed fixed on Thomas with a seriousness that didn't belong to someone her age. A few of the guests glanced at her, confused about how a child had wandered into a private memorial attended by executives, attorneys, and people who usually never notice strangers. One of Thomas's assistants stepped forward politely, preparing to guide the girl away before the moment became awkward, but the girl spoke again before anyone could move. "She's alive," Maya Johnson repeated, her voice still steady, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. The name Elena Becket hung in the air above the crowd like a question nobody wanted to answer. Thomas felt something strange tighten in his chest, not belief, not hope, something more dangerous than both. He had spent an entire year forcing himself to accept reality, forcing his mind to close the door on every impossible scenario. Yet the girl's expression wasn't the wild imagination of a child seeking attention. She looked like someone remembering something she wished she could forget. "That's not possible," one of the lawyers whispered nearby, but Thomas didn't answer. The rain continued falling in quiet silver threads across the cemetery as the billionaire studied the girl more closely. She didn't step back. She didn't apologize. She simply waited, as if she knew the words she had spoken had already begun to change something. Finally, Thomas Becket took a slow breath and asked the question that no one else was brave enough to ask. "Why would you say something like that?" The girl lifted one small hand and pointed toward the distant harbor beyond the trees where the water met the gray horizon. "Because," Maya said softly, "I saw what happened the night everyone else stopped looking." Thomas Becket did not answer the girl immediately, and the quiet tension stretching across the cemetery seemed to grow heavier with every passing second as the rain continued to fall across the polished gravestone bearing Elena Becket's name. And the gathered guests who had expected a simple farewell now watched the strange exchange unfold with uneasy curiosity, while Maya Johnson stood exactly where she had spoken, her small shoulders still and her eyes fixed on the billionaire as if she had already decided that leaving was not an option. And Thomas slowly stepped away from the memorial stone, the wet grass bending beneath his shoes as he closed part of the distance between them, while several assistants exchanged nervous looks because no one was certain how seriously their employer might take the words of a child who had appeared from nowhere at a private ceremony. Yet Thomas had spent his life reading people during negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the expression on the girl's face did not resemble imagination or mischief, but something steadier, something closer to memory. And when he stopped about 10 feet from her, he noticed details that the others had missed, including the faint salt stains on the cuffs of her jacket, and the way her gaze kept drifting toward the distant harbor that could just barely be seen beyond the line of dark winter trees that bordered the cemetery. And that was when he spoke again with a calm voice that carried across the quiet crowd, asking her to explain exactly what she meant, and Maya shifted slightly on her feet before answering, as if she were carefully choosing which part of a long story could be understood by people who had not been there on the night she remembered, explaining that she often slept near the old shipping docks about 2 miles from the harbor where fishing boats and maintenance vessels stayed during storms because the area had abandoned storage buildings that gave shelter from the wind. And on the night the yacht accident had been reported, the storm had been so loud that even the harbor lights flickered against the dark water, while waves pushed against the concrete piers like restless shadows. And Maya said that sometime after midnight, she had been awake watching the rain because she could not sleep when thunder rolled across the bay, when she noticed headlights moving along the service road near the water, which was unusual because most harbor traffic stopped during heavy storms. And she remembered seeing a large vehicle parked near the end of the pier, where smaller boats were sometimes tied when they arrived unexpectedly. And at first she thought it might be a rescue team, because people often helped stranded sailors during bad weather. But the people she saw did not look like harbor workers, and they did not act like emergency crews either. And Maya paused briefly while the rain tapped softly against the umbrellas around them before, continuing in the same steady voice that had first stopped the ceremony, saying that she saw someone being helped out of a small boat that had come close to the pier during the storm, and the person looked weak and exhausted, as if the cold ocean had taken every ounce of strength from her body. And the people near the vehicle quickly covered her with a large coat before guiding her toward the open door. And Maya admitted that she might have ignored the moment entirely because strangers often passed through the harbor late at night, except for one detail that had stayed in her mind long after the storm ended and the harbor returned to silence. Because while the wind carried the sound across the empty pier, she heard the woman speak only one word before the vehicle door closed, and that word was a name spoken with quiet desperation, the name Thomas. The name echoed softly through the quiet cemetery as the girl finished speaking, and for a moment Thomas Becket did not move at all, because hearing his own name placed inside a memory from that storm filled the silence with something heavier than disbelief. It filled it with the dangerous possibility that the story he had forced himself to accept might have been incomplete, and the people gathered around them could sense the shift even if they did not fully understand it, because the billionaire, who normally carried the calm authority of a man who controlled boardrooms and global companies, now stood perfectly still in the rain, while his thoughts raced backward through the last year of unanswered questions and sleepless nights, remembering the investigation reports that described the wreckage of the yacht, the statements from the Coast Guard, the weather data, the long list of conclusions that had convinced everyone that the ocean had simply taken what it wanted, yet none of those reports had ever explained the strange details that had quietly bothered him even after the case was closed. Details such as why the yacht's emergency signal had activated nearly 15 minutes after the last satellite ping instead of immediately when the storm reached its peak, and why one of the harbor security cameras had stopped recording during the same window of time when the storm was strongest. And at the time, those irregularities had been dismissed as technical failures caused by severe weather. But now, as the girl stood before him calmly describing a vehicle waiting near the pier and a woman speaking his name across the wind, those forgotten fragments of uncertainty began fitting together in a way that made Thomas feel the ground beneath his feet differently. Not like solid certainty, but like something shifting beneath a carefully built story. And one of his senior assistants finally stepped forward, trying to restore the order that the ceremony had lost, gently telling Maya that the event was private and that she should leave the property. Yet Thomas raised his hand before the man could finish speaking, and the simple gesture instantly silenced the conversation around them, because everyone present understood that when Thomas Becket made a decision, he expected the world to pause long enough for him to think. And he studied Maya again with a deeper attention than before, noticing that despite the cold rain, she did not appear nervous or eager for attention the way most children would in front of a crowd of strangers. Instead, she looked patient, as if she had carried this memory for a long time, and had only now found the moment when someone might finally listen. And Thomas asked her one more question that seemed small, but carried the weight of everything she had said so far, asking whether she was certain about the voice she heard in the storm, because storms distort sound and distance can trick the mind. Yet Maya shook her head slowly and answered with the same quiet confidence that had first interrupted the ceremony, explaining that she had been closer than people might expect, because the abandoned building where she sheltered sat less than 30 yards from the end of the pier, and the wind had shifted just long enough for the voice to carry clearly across the water. And then she added something that caused several people in the crowd to exchange surprised looks because it was not something the news had ever reported during the long investigation. She said the woman who spoke his name had also been wearing a thin silver bracelet with a small star-shaped charm that flashed briefly under the pier lights when the people helping her guided her toward the vehicle. And Thomas Becket felt a sudden quiet pressure behind his ribs because Elena had owned only one bracelet like that, a simple silver piece she had worn almost every day since their first anniversary, a gift he had given her during a quiet weekend in Santa Barbara long before the world had begun watching every move of his career, and the realization settled slowly through his mind as the rain continued to fall across the cemetery, because that bracelet had never been listed among the items recovered from the damaged yacht. And for the first time since the storm took his wife away, Thomas Becket looked beyond the gravestone in front of him and began wondering whether the truth of that night had been waiting somewhere far from the ocean all along. Thomas Becket did not speak for several long seconds after hearing about the bracelet, and the quiet cemetery seemed to hold its breath while the rain continued falling in steady silver lines across the dark coats of the guests. And the billionaire slowly turned his head toward the harbor again, as if the distant water might suddenly explain the missing pieces of a story that had never felt completely finished, because he remembered that bracelet clearly, a delicate silver chain with a small star charm that Elena had worn so often that it had become almost part of her identity. And when the yacht wreckage was recovered, the investigation report listed a watch, a pair of sunglasses, and fragments of personal belongings, but the bracelet had never appeared on the inventory list, a detail that had once seemed insignificant but now echoed in his mind like a quiet alarm that had been waiting a year to be heard. And several people in the crowd began whispering softly while Thomas considered the girl's words. Yet Maya Johnson did not move or repeat herself, as if she understood that the moment had already passed from explanation into decision, and Thomas finally looked back at her with a focus that was far different from the polite curiosity he had shown earlier, because now he was measuring every word she had said against the fragments of truth he still carried from the night Elena disappeared. And he asked Maya a question that caused several assistants nearby to glance at each other in surprise, because it sounded less like disbelief and more like the beginning of an investigation, asking whether she had seen anything else that night besides the vehicle and the woman on the pier. And Maya thought quietly for a moment before answering that the storm had made it difficult to see clearly, but there had been one more thing that stayed in her memory, something unusual about the vehicle itself, because the headlights had briefly illuminated the side of the van when it turned toward the service road, and she had noticed a small logo printed near the rear door, a simple dark emblem shaped like overlapping circles that she had seen before in the city on construction trucks and supply vehicles. And Thomas felt the familiar instinct of a strategist begin to sharpen inside his mind, because that emblem sounded familiar to him as well, not as a random company mark, but as the logo used by one of the transportation contractors that regularly worked with Becket Industries on infrastructure projects along the California coast. And the realization made the cold rain feel suddenly sharper against his face, because it meant that the vehicle described by the girl might not belong to strangers at all, but to a company that had at some point been connected to his own network of business partners. And one of the senior lawyers stepped closer with a concerned expression, as if hoping to redirect the situation back toward the memorial ceremony that was supposed to be taking place. Yet Thomas quietly reached into his coat pocket and removed his phone without taking his eyes off Maya. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority that had built one of the largest private companies in the country, instructing his assistant Daniel Carter to cancel every remaining appointment scheduled for the afternoon and to contact the private security team at Becket Industries headquarters immediately, because he wanted access to the full investigation archive from the yacht incident, including the harbor security footage, the Coast Guard reports, and every document that had been filed during the previous year. And the assistant hesitated for only a second before nodding and stepping away to make the call, because everyone present understood that when Thomas Becket shifted from grief to action, the world around him moved quickly. And Maya watched quietly while the decision unfolded, as if she had known from the beginning that this conversation would lead somewhere beyond the cemetery. And after a Moment Thomas lowered his phone and looked at her again before asking the question that would change the rest of the day for both of them, asking whether she would be willing to show him the exact pier where she had seen the vehicle that night. And the girl nodded once without hesitation while the rain continued falling across the gravestone behind them, leaving the name Elena Beckett shining faintly beneath the gray afternoon sky as the first real search for the truth finally began. The black sedan left the quiet cemetery less than 10 minutes later, its dark body moving smoothly down the narrow road while the rain softened into a steady mist that blurred the distant harbor lights. And inside the car, Thomas Beckett sat in the back seat across from Maya Johnson, while the city slowly replaced the rows of gravestones behind them, the silence between them not uncomfortable but thoughtful as. The billionaire watched the shoreline appear through the rain-covered window, remembering how many times he had traveled these same roads during the past year, while searching for answers that never appeared. Yet now the smallest new detail had reopened a path he had believed was permanently closed. And Maya sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, while the car passed through familiar streets where fishing stores, weathered warehouses, and quiet marina offices lined the waterfront district. A part of the city that rarely appeared in financial magazines or luxury travel guides, even though it quietly supported thousands of workers who kept the coastal economy moving every day. And Thomas finally broke the silence by asking Maya how long she had been staying near the harbor, because the abandoned building she mentioned earlier was nearly 2 miles from the main docks, and the weather there could become dangerously cold during winter storms. And Maya answered honestly that she had been there for several months after moving through different shelters across the city, explaining that the building near the pier had broken windows, but the concrete walls blocked most of the wind, and sometimes fishermen left extra food or blankets when they noticed someone sleeping nearby. And Thomas listened without interrupting because he understood that details about the girl's life were important not only for kindness, but also for understanding how carefully she might observe the world around her. And people who lived outdoors often noticed things that others overlooked because survival depended on reading every movement and sound. And the driver turned onto Harbor Service Road, where the air smelled faintly of salt and diesel fuel from the boats that rested along the long concrete piers stretching into the gray water. And several security vehicles from Beckett Industries were already waiting near the entrance, because Daniel Carter had clearly acted quickly after receiving Thomas's instructions. And as the sedan slowed, Maya leaned forward slightly and pointed through the windshield toward a section of the harbor where an older pier extended about 200 feet into the water beside a cluster of rust-colored storage buildings that had been closed for years. And she said quietly that the vehicle she saw during the storm had stopped near the far end of that pier, where a faded yellow light still hung above a maintenance ladder that led down to the waterline. And Thomas stepped out of the car as the mist drifted across the harbor, while several members of his private security team approached, respectfully waiting for instructions. And he walked slowly toward the pier with Maya beside him, while the gray waves tapped gently against the wooden posts below. And when they reached the point she had indicated, she looked around carefully before pointing to a specific section of the concrete where faint tire marks had once appeared during the storm, though most had long since faded beneath months of sun and rain. And Thomas followed her gaze before turning toward one of his security officers and calmly instructing him to contact the harbor authority immediately, because he wanted access to every camera that had been operating within a 3-mile radius of this pier during the night of the storm, including private marina systems and traffic cameras along the service roads. And the officer nodded while speaking into a radio as the first pieces of the investigation quietly began falling into place. And Thomas remained standing at the edge of the pier looking out across the water where the horizon stretched into the distance, because somewhere beyond that gray line the official story of the yacht accident had begun. Yet here on this quiet strip of concrete another story might have unfolded entirely differently. And beside him Maya Johnson watched the harbor in silence, knowing that the night she had never forgotten was finally being taken seriously by someone powerful enough to search for the truth. The harbor was unusually quiet that afternoon as a thin layer of fog drifted slowly across the water, and the distant sound of boat masts tapping against metal echoed softly between the piers. And Thomas Beckett remained standing near the edge of the concrete platform, while members of his security team moved efficiently around the area, placing small markers and documenting the location Maya Johnson had pointed out only minutes earlier, because even though nearly a year had passed since the storm, the billionaire understood that careful observation sometimes revealed details that ordinary investigations overlooked, and Maya stood beside him watching the activity with calm patience while the wind lifted strands of her hair and carried the faint scent of salt through the air. And after a few minutes, Daniel Carter arrived in another vehicle, carrying a tablet computer that connected directly to the private network used by Beckett Industries security operations, and he walked quickly toward Thomas while explaining that the team had already contacted the Harbor Authority and obtained temporary access to archive camera footage from multiple sources, including traffic cameras along Harbor Service Road and security systems from several nearby storage facilities that had continued operating during the storm. And Thomas accepted the tablet without speaking and began reviewing the timeline Daniel had assembled, showing the hours surrounding the night Elena Beckett's yacht signal disappeared from the Coast Guard tracking system, and the screen displayed a sequence of small video windows, each representing a different camera location positioned around the harbor district, and most of them showed only sheets of rain moving across empty pavement while the storm winds pushed debris along the roadways. Yet one camera mounted above an old maintenance building approximately half a mile from the pier showed something different. A pair of headlights traveling slowly along the service road just after midnight before turning toward the direction Maya had indicated earlier, and Thomas studied the timestamp, carefully noting that it appeared less than 20 minutes after the emergency beacon from Elena's yacht had transmitted its final signal offshore. And Daniel explained that the vehicle's path matched the same route Maya described earlier because the camera briefly captured the van passing beneath a streetlight before disappearing toward the pier where the girl had sheltered during the storm. And the image quality was not perfect due to the weather, but one detail remained visible enough to identify the faint shape of overlapping circular symbols painted near the rear panel of the vehicle, exactly as Maya had remembered. And Thomas felt the quiet focus inside his mind sharpen even further because the logo belonged to HarborLink Logistics, a mid-sized transportation contractor that Beckett Industries had hired several times over the past decade to move equipment between coastal construction sites. And the discovery caused Daniel to glance at him carefully because he understood the implication immediately. If one of HarborLink's vehicles had been present near the pier during the storm, then someone connected to that company might know far more about the night Elena disappeared than the official investigation ever revealed. And Thomas continued watching the video as the headlights vanished from the screen, leaving only darkness and rain behind. And he slowly lowered the tablet while looking out across the gray water beyond the pier, because the ocean had been blamed for the tragedy, but the evidence now suggested something else entirely, something that had moved quietly through the harbor while the storm distracted everyone who might have noticed. And beside him Maya Johnson waited silently until Thomas finally turned toward his security team and spoke with the calm authority that once again filled his voice, instructing them to gather every contract Beckett Industries had ever signed with HarborLink Logistics, and to locate the exact vehicle recorded in the footage, because if that van had truly been at the pier that night, then the path toward the truth had just begun to reveal itself. The fog over the harbor thickened as the afternoon slowly faded toward evening, and the gray water beyond the pier reflected the dim lights from nearby storage buildings, while Thomas Beckett stood quietly reviewing the information Daniel Carter had just received from the Beckett Industries database. Because the moment the name HarborLink Logistics appeared in the footage, the security team had already begun tracing every contract, vehicle record, and employee associated with the company during the past 2 years. And now Daniel approached with a serious expression while holding another tablet that displayed a series of documents pulled from the corporate archives. And he explained that HarborLink Logistics had provided transportation services for several infrastructure projects funded by Beckett Industries, including the coastal bridge renovation north of the city and the offshore energy maintenance route near Santa Catalina Island. But what caught Daniel's attention was a specific vehicle listed in the fleet registry, a dark cargo van with the same overlapping circle logo Maya described earlier, which according to the records had been assigned to a driver scheduled to transport equipment through the harbor district on the exact night of the storm. And Thomas took the tablet while the cool harbor wind moved across the pier and carefully studied the digital file that showed the van identification number, maintenance logs, and the name of the assigned driver, a man called Richard Holloway, who had worked for HarborLink Logistics for nearly 6 years before suddenly leaving the company only 3 weeks after the yacht accident investigation had officially ended, and the timing caused Thomas to narrow his eyes slightly, because experienced businessmen often recognize patterns that others overlooked, and a sudden resignation following such. A specific event rarely happened without a reason, and Daniel continued explaining that the company reported Holloway had moved out of state shortly after leaving the job, but the forwarding address listed in the personnel file appeared incomplete and had not been updated since the day he resigned, and Thomas remained silent for several seconds while the quiet rhythm of water tapping against the pier echoed below them, because in the world he knew people did not disappear by coincidence, especially when their movements aligned so precisely with unanswered questions. And Maya Johnson stood a few steps away listening carefully as the adults discussed the discovery. And even though much of the conversation involved technical details, she understood enough to realize that the investigation was finally uncovering real connections to the night she had witnessed from the shelter of the abandoned building. And Thomas eventually handed the tablet back to Daniel before turning toward the harbor lights that had begun flickering on along the shoreline as evening approached. And he spoke calmly while instructing his security team to locate every available record connected to Richard Holloway, including vehicle tracking data, fuel receipts, and toll road entries that might reveal where the HarborLink van traveled after leaving the pier during the storm. Because if the driver had transported someone away from the harbor that night, then the path of that vehicle might still exist. Inside digital records scattered across highways, parking systems, and shipping terminals across the state. And Daniel nodded immediately while transmitting the request through the security network as several analysts at Beckett Industries headquarters began searching databases across multiple transportation systems. And the quiet harbor scene remained unchanged on the surface, with only fog drifting slowly across the water and gulls circling the distant docks. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a chain of information had begun moving through computers and communication lines that stretched far beyond the pier. And Thomas Beckett stood beside Maya, looking out across the dim horizon, because somewhere along the roads that van had traveled, the truth about Elena Beckett might still be waiting to be found. The harbor lights had fully come on by the time the first results from the Beckett Industries analysts began arriving, and the soft glow from the lamps along the pier reflected across the calm water, while a cool evening breeze moved slowly through the fog, and Thomas Beckett stood beside the dark sedan reviewing the latest information Daniel Carter had just received through the security network, because within less than an hour the analysts had managed to trace several digital records connected to the HarborLink Logistics van that appeared in the storm night footage, and the timeline that began forming on Daniel's tablet revealed something that immediately caught Thomas's attention. The vehicle had not disappeared into the city as investigators once assumed, but instead traveled north along the coastal highway approximately 30 minutes after leaving the harbor service road, and one toll camera located nearly 18 miles outside the city had recorded the same van passing through shortly after 1:30 in the morning while the storm was still moving across the coastline. And Daniel explained that although the weather had blurred the license plate, the vehicle identification number partially matched the HarborLink fleet registry that had already been pulled from the company archives earlier that afternoon, and Thomas carefully studied the route displayed on the screen because the direction of travel pointed toward a stretch of remote shoreline where several private marinas and small research facilities operated far from the public harbor district, places where unusual activity might easily pass unnoticed during severe weather. And the analysts had also located a fuel purchase made using a HarborLink corporate card less than 40 minutes after the toll record appeared, a transaction completed at a small service station positioned along a quiet 2-lane highway that eventually led toward an isolated coastal research campus operated by multiple private contractors who specialized in maritime engineering projects. And Daniel noted that one of those facilities had previously worked with Beckett Industries on underwater survey equipment nearly 5 years earlier, although the partnership ended after the project was completed. And Thomas remained silent for several seconds while the information settled into place, because the emerging pattern suggested that the van Maya had described might not have been traveling randomly through the storm, but following a specific route toward a destination carefully chosen in advance. And Maya Johnson stood nearby listening while the adults discussed the discoveries, And although the names of companies and roads meant little to her, she recognized the change in Thomas's expression because earlier he had looked uncertain while standing beside Elena's memorial stone, but now his focus had returned to the steady determination of someone who had spent years solving complex problems under pressure. And after another moment, Thomas finally looked up from the tablet and asked Daniel one more question that immediately redirected the investigation toward its next step. He asked whether the analysts had identified any active operations still running at the Coastal Research Campus connected to that highway route. And Daniel nodded while bringing up another document that showed the facility had recently been leased by a private maritime consulting firm that specialized in experimental navigation systems and ocean data equipment, a company that operated quietly with only a small number of employees and very limited public reporting requirements. And Thomas glanced once more toward the dark water beyond the pier before turning back toward the waiting vehicles because the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clear direction. And he calmly instructed the security team to prepare transportation immediately because if the van that left this harbor during the storm truly followed the path revealed by the digital records, then the answers they had been searching for might be waiting less than 40 miles up the coast beyond the reach of the city lights. The convoy of dark vehicles left the harbor shortly after night settled across the coastline, and the headlights stretched along the empty highway as Thomas Beckett sat quietly in the back seat reviewing the route displayed on the digital map in front of him, while the Pacific Ocean rolled invisibly beyond the cliffs to their left. And beside him, Maya Johnson watched the distant lights of small towns pass through the window as the city slowly disappeared behind them, because the destination Daniel Carter had identified was located nearly 40 miles north along a narrow coastal stretch where private research facilities operated far from busy commercial harbors. And the drive took less than an hour before the vehicles turned onto a private road that wound through low hills covered with wind-shaped trees until a cluster of buildings appeared ahead surrounded by a tall fence and several dim security lights that glowed against the fog drifting inland from the ocean. And Daniel explained that the property belonged to the maritime consulting firm mentioned earlier in the investigation records, a quiet organization that specialized in experimental navigation systems and underwater mapping technology, but had almost no public presence despite maintaining expensive equipment along the coast. And Thomas stepped out of the car as the cool night air carried the distant sound of waves crashing softly against the rocks far below the cliffs, and the security team approached the closed gate, where a small guard station stood beside the road, while Daniel contacted the facility manager using the corporate registration number connected to the property lease. And after a brief exchange, the gate slowly opened because the presence of Beckett Industries had apparently been enough to convince the staff that cooperation would be easier than refusing entry, and the convoy moved inside the compound where several low research buildings stood arranged around a central loading yard illuminated by bright overhead lamps. And the moment Thomas stepped onto the pavement, he noticed something that caused him to pause quietly before speaking, because parked near the far end of the yard was a familiar shape partially covered by a protective tarp, the dark outline of a cargo van with a faint symbol visible through the fabric where overlapping circles formed the exact logo Maya Johnson had described earlier at the harbor pier, and the discovery drew the attention of everyone present, while Daniel walked closer to examine the vehicle identification number printed along the front frame, confirming within seconds that it matched the HarborLink logistics van recorded by the toll camera on the night of the storm. And the realization settled across the quiet yard like a sudden shift in the wind because the long chain of clues beginning at Elena Beckett's memorial had now led directly to this remote facility overlooking the ocean. And Thomas stood silently for a moment before looking toward Maya, who had followed the group across the yard and now stared at the van with the same calm certainty she carried from the beginning. And although the night air felt cold against the cliffs, Thomas's voice remained steady as he instructed the security team to begin documenting every detail inside the compound, because the truth that had remained hidden for an entire year had finally reached a place where it could no longer remain invisible. And far beyond the lights of the research buildings, the dark ocean stretched toward the horizon exactly as it had on the night of the storm. Yet now the silence surrounding that night had begun to break as the investigation moved one final step closer to revealing what truly happened to Elena Beckett.